Under the harsh white lights of a crowded courtroom, everyone expected a routine hearing, papers shuffled, whispers faded, and the judge prepared to speak. Then it happened. Police officers suddenly turned their attention to one woman standing alone, her hands trembling as they mocked her, questioned her dignity, and treated her like she didn't matter. You could feel the tension thicken in the air, the kind that makes your chest tight even if you're just watching. No one spoke up. No one moved. But what the police didn't know was that this moment meant to break her was about to expose a truth so powerful it would flip the courtroom upside down. Within minutes, the same room that watched in silence would be forced to confront its own shame, and what followed would leave everyone, including the officers, completely speechless. The courtroom was already tense before anything happened. Wooden benches creaked as people shifted uncomfortably, whispers bouncing off the high walls like nervous echoes. The air smelled faintly of old paper, polish, and something heavier fear. She stood near the defense table, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had turned white, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if looking up might shatter what little strength she had left. Her name had just been called, and with that single sound, her world narrowed to the slow pounding of her own heartbeat. She was not a criminal. She had come seeking justice. But the moment she took a step forward, the mood changed. Two police officers stood nearby, their uniforms crisp, their expressions cold and practiced. One of them spoke loudly, far louder than necessary, his voice sharp enough to slice through the silence. He questioned her credibility, her story, her presence, each word designed not to seek truth, but to strip dignity. People in the gallery exchanged glances. Some frowned. Others stared, frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing procedure or cruelty. She tried to speak, but her voice trembled. Before she could finish a sentence, the officer interrupted her again, mocking the pauses in her speech, twisting her hesitation into suspicion. The courtroom laughed, just a few people at first, uncomfortable chuckles, but it was enough. Her shoulders sagged. Her lips parted, then closed. Whatever courage she had walked in with was slipping away. The judge did not intervene, not yet. The second officer stepped closer, invading her personal space, pointing at her as if she were an object on trial rather than a human being. He raised his voice even more, repeating private details from her statement, details that never should have been spoken aloud. Gasps rippled through the room. Her face flushed deep red, then pale. Her eyes shimmered, but she refused to cry, not here. Not in front of them. Her lawyer stood, attempting to object, but was waved off casually, as though his words were an inconvenience. The humiliation continued, deliberate and public. Each question felt less like an inquiry and more like an accusation. Why didn't you report sooner? Why were you there? Why should anyone believe you? With every why, something inside her cracked. In the back row, an elderly woman lowered her head. A young man clenched his fists. The atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to discomfort, from tension to outrage. This was no longer about a case. It was about power. She finally looked up. Her eyes scanned the room not in anger, but in quiet desperation. She searched for someone, anyone, who might step in. Her gaze passed over strangers, over faces she didn't know, until it reached the judge's bench. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The judge's expression was unreadable. Then something unexpected happened. From the side of the courtroom, a soft sound broke through the noise, a single voice saying, "That's enough." It wasn't loud. It wasn't commanding. But it was firm, clear, human. Heads turned. The officer paused mid-sentence, visibly annoyed. "This is an official proceeding," he snapped, turning toward the voice. But the damage was done. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The woman standing at the center of it all straightened her back just slightly. She took a breath slow, deliberate, as if gathering the fragments of herself that had been scattered across the floor. What no one in that courtroom realized yet was this: the humiliation they had just witnessed was the spark. And what was about to follow would not only expose the truth but change every life in that room forever. The courtroom felt colder than before, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the silence that followed the humiliation. The woman sat back down slowly, her hands trembling as she folded them in her lap. A faint red mark was still visible on her wrist where the officer had grabbed her too tightly, as if reminding everyone of what had just happened. Some people avoided looking at her, embarrassed by their own silence. Others stared openly, curiosity mixing with discomfort. The judge adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and tried to move the proceedings forward as if nothing unusual had occurred, but the energy in the room had already shifted. The judge hesitated. Court protocol was strict, and witnesses weren't supposed to speak out of turn. But something in her composure made him pause. He nodded once, reluctantly granting permission. That single nod changed everything. She reached into her worn handbag and pulled out a thin folder, its edges bent from use. It didn't look impressive, and that was exactly why no one took it seriously at first. The officer smirked, exchanging a glance with his colleague, clearly convinced this was going nowhere. Inside were copies of reports, official documents, and most importantly, printed screenshots of body camera timestamps. She explained how she had requested footage through legal channels, how some clips had gone missing, and how others showed clear violations of procedure. A murmur rippled through the audience. This was no emotional outburst. This was evidence. The officer shifted uncomfortably now, his earlier confidence replaced by visible unease. The judge asked her to approach the bench and submit the documents. As she walked forward, the same officer who had humiliated her earlier instinctively stepped back. It was subtle, but everyone saw it. Power was changing hands, not loudly, but unmistakably. The judge reviewed the first few pages, his expression tightening. He called for a brief recess, something rarely done so abruptly. The courtroom buzzed as people whispered, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Reporters in the back started typing furiously. The woman returned to her seat, her face pale but resolute. For the first time, someone beside her whispered, "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her eyes glistened. When the judge returned, the tone of the room was different. Formal. Serious. He announced that the court would be addressing the conduct of the officers involved before proceeding any further. The officer who had mocked her earlier stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if the walls themselves had turned against him. In that moment, it became clear that this was no longer just her case. It was something bigger. What began as humiliation had cracked open a truth that couldn't be ignored, and the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore, it was heavy, waiting for consequences. The courtroom felt heavier than before, as if the air itself had thickened after the woman's quiet refusal to break. What had started as humiliation was now turning into something far more dangerous for those who thought they were in control. The judge leaned forward, tapping their pen against the desk, his expression shifting from boredom to irritation. The officers who had laughed minutes earlier now stood stiff, their confidence cracked by the calm strength in her eyes. She wiped the corner of her mouth where blood had dried, not in shame, but with the slow dignity of someone who refused to be reduced to a spectacle. Her lawyer rose. Again, this time without raising his voice. He requested that the court review supplementary material related to the arrest. The word supplementary sounded harmless, almost forgettable, but it changed everything. A clerk hesitated before connecting a cable to the courtroom screen. One of the officers took a step forward, opening his mouth to object, but the judge raised a hand. "Let's see it," he said, unaware that the room was seconds away from freezing in collective disbelief. The screen flickered, then steadied. Security footage appeared, grainy but unmistakable. It showed a narrow hallway inside the police station from the night of her arrest. There she was, handcuffed, walking slowly, flanked by the same officers who had just mocked her. At first, the video was silent, almost ordinary. Then the sound came through, a shove, a laugh. Words that didn't belong to any rulebook or oath. The woman in the video stumbled, her shoulder slamming into the wall. One officer leaned close, whispering something that made her flinch. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Someone in the back covered their mouth. The judge's pen stopped mid-tap. On screen, the humiliation continued, not loud, not dramatic, but worse, casual, routine, the kind of cruelty that comes from believing no one will ever question you. The officers in the courtroom stared straight ahead, faces drained of color. As if looking at the screen would somehow confirm their guilt beyond repair, the video cut to another angle, this time an interrogation room. The woman sat alone, hands cuffed to a metal ring. An officer entered, closed the door, and turned off the camera, or thought he did. The audio remained, threats followed, not shouted, but spoken softly, like advice. Her voice trembled as she pleaded, not for freedom, but for respect. "I didn't do anything," she said in the recording. "Please." The room fell silent except for the echo of her words, now filling the courtroom that had once laughed at her pain. When the screen finally went black, no one moved. The silence wasn't polite or procedural, it was stunned. The judge cleared his throat, but no sound came out. He tried again. "Court will take a brief recess," he said, standing abruptly. But even as he spoke, it was clear the damage was done. This wasn't something a recess could fix. The woman remained seated, eyes forward. She didn't cry. She didn't look back at the officers. Her strength wasn't loud or dramatic, it was devastating in its restraint. For the first time, people weren't looking at her bruises. They were looking at what those bruises represented and who had caused them. Reporters scribbled furiously. A man in the front row shook his head, whispering, "My God." One officer finally lowered his gaze, his jaw tightening as if he'd just realized the uniform no longer protected him. The laughter from earlier felt like it belonged to another lifetime. As the judge exited, the bailiff announced the recess again, louder this time, but the room remained frozen. Everyone understood that the trial had shifted. This was no longer about her credibility, it was about accountability, and as she slowly stood, guided gently by her attorney, one truth settled heavily over the courtroom: whatever happened next would not be quiet. And it would not be forgotten. The courtroom had gone so quiet it felt unreal, like the air itself was holding its breath. The woman stood at the center, hands trembling at her sides, the marks of humiliation still fresh on her face. But something had changed. It wasn't visible at first glance. It was in her posture, in the way she lifted her chin just slightly, in the steadiness of her breathing, as if she had finally decided she would not shrink anymore. The judge adjusted his glasses, sensing the shift, while the same officers who had mocked her minutes earlier avoided her eyes, suddenly unsure of their own power. Then she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried a calm weight that cut deeper than shouting ever could. She asked permission to address the court one last time, and when the judge nodded, the room leaned in. She didn't accuse. She didn't beg, she simply told the truth. She described, in clear and careful words, what had happened the night she was arrested, how the officers laughed while she cried, how they twisted her words into jokes, how her dignity had been treated like entertainment as she spoke. Something remarkable happened. The humiliation that once clung to her began to transfer, slowly and unmistakably, to the people who had caused it. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. A murmur rippled through the gallery as details surfaced that had never made it into the official report. Body cameras, she revealed, had been on longer than the officers realized. A clerk raised her head sharply. The judge's expression hardened. When the footage was requested, no one objected. They couldn't. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly the courtroom wasn't just hearing her story, it was witnessing it. Laughter echoed from the speakers, crude and unmistakable. A voice mimicked her crying. Another told her to stop acting. Gasps filled the room. One officer's face drained of color as his own words came back to haunt him. The woman stood still, watching herself on the screen, reliving the worst moments of her life in front of strangers, but she did not look away. Her strength, raw and unfiltered, became impossible to ignore. When the video ended, silence returned, heavier than before. The judge removed his glasses and set them down carefully, as if buying time to process what everyone had just seen. His voice, when it came, was firm and unmistakably changed. He addressed the officers directly, asking them to explain behavior that clearly violated procedure, ethics, and basic human decency. Their answers were weak, fragmented, and full of excuses that only made things worse. Then came the moment no one expected. The judge turned back to the woman and apologized on the record. Not a vague expression of regret, but a clear acknowledgement that the system had failed her in that room, on that night, and in this very court. The apology didn't erase her pain, but it shifted something fundamental. It told everyone watching that her dignity mattered, that her voice mattered. Consequences followed swiftly. An internal investigation was ordered. Immediately, the case against her was dismissed. The officers were removed from duty pending review. But beyond the formal actions, something deeper had occurred. The courtroom, once a place where she was humiliated, had become the place where the truth finally stood taller than power. As she walked out, the gallery parted without a word. Some people looked at her with shame, others with quiet admiration. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Justice, imperfect and late, had finally spoken. And for the first time since she was dragged into that system, she walked forward not as a victim, but as a woman who had forced silence onto those who once tried to silence her. The courtroom was silent, but the silence wasn't empty, it was heavy, charged with the weight of what had just unfolded. The woman stood there, her chest still heaving, eyes glistening with tears, yet filled with a newfound strength that no one had expected. The same people who had humiliated her moments ago now looked at her with a mix of shock and respect. She had reclaimed her voice, and in doing so, she had silenced the whispers of injustice that had lingered for far too long. This moment reminded everyone watching and everyone listening that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's standing up quietly when the world expects you to stay down. She didn't just survive humiliation. She transformed it into a powerful statement that resonated far beyond the courtroom walls. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on the strength we all carry, subscribe to our channel for more real, emotional, and eye-opening stories. Hit the like button to support the story reaching more people. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And comment below your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in her place? Remember, every voice matters, and every story deserves to be heard. Stay with us for more stories that touch hearts, awaken courage, and reveal truths.